allow me to introduce our next esteemed guest. So Dr. Vandana Shiva is a scholar, environmental activist, food sovereignty advocate, and anti-globalization author. She has dedicated her life's work on the ecological and social impacts of corporate globalization based on limitless growth and limitless greed on the earth, on women, on farmers, and is a founding board member of the International Forum of Globalization. She has created a grassroots movement to save seeds, protect farmers' rights, and biodiversity to respond to patents on seeds. Very exciting to hear more about this. And Dr. Shiva currently is based in Delhi and has authored more than 20 books. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Vandana Shiva. Over to you.
Thank you, Samantha. Yes, we have to reset everything, not just because there's a little virus around, which wasn't supposed to be a disease epidemic for humans. It was supposed to belong to the forest. It was supposed to be on the bats. Greed and globalization has brought it to us. It spread it. And the reason I started to work on issues of globalization was both because globalization came to us as colonialism. You know, the first free trade treaty is not WTO or NAFTA. It's a Right Honorable East India Company making a deal with a collapsing Mughal emperor Farrukhji to say, you know, we'll have the right to trade, we won't be taxed, we'll have protection, and local traders will be taxed. That kind of punishment of the local and reward to the global is how the trade of globalization won. But globalization began with East India Company. It's not that trade began with East India Company. A lot of people have huge confusion. They think if you critique the rules of trade written by the greedy to get more markets, more resources, that somehow you don't believe in international trade. Well, I come from the country that was the big international trader. We were 25% of the world's economy till the East India Company invaded. We were the big traders in spices. And a sack of black pepper used to be exchanged with a sack of gold, which is why East India Company was created. Or, for that matter, the blue dye called indigo used to be exchanged for its equivalent weight in gold. That's why when the East India Company took over, they turned indigo cultivation into a slave economy, a plantation economy, and Gandhi's first civil disobedience, when he returned to India, after his disobedience against the rules of racial discrimination in South Africa, you know, in 1909, 1906, he started that. In 1911, they had to withdraw the laws. And later they established the apartheid regime. But when Gandhi came back in 1915, the first movement he supported was the refusal to grow indigo. It was called the Indigo Satyagraha, the Champaran Satyagraha. So international trade is not the same as globalization. International trade engaged in by free people, sovereign people, is the kind of trade we had and the kind of trade we should have. Globalization is the name given to the phenomena where corporations write the rule. In the time of colonialism, it was East India Company, the first corporation created in the world. Most people, you know, especially the younger generation, you all imagine corporations have always been around. No, trade has been around, business has been around, farming has been around, but embodiment and legal construction of a corporation with limited liability, it was made for the first time in 1600 with the creation of the East India Company. And why, and how was it created? The Queen was made to sign a charter. Say, go conquer lands, use armies, use private military. And if your ships loaded with spices and textiles gets stolen by the Dutch because they also had an East India Company, then society will pay the losses. But if the ship comes back, then it's yours. So limited liability was socialism of costs and privatization of profits. We had independence, we became sovereign, international trade carried on, we decided what we'd import, we decided what we'd export, we decided what we'd produce. Then you get the WTO. And I got into the WTO scene because I was at a meeting in Geneva where the corporations had talked about now they'll own the seed, they'll patent the seed, and they'll have an international agreement to impose it on the world. That's the first time I heard of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. That's the first time I heard there's an intellectual property rights in it. And that's the day I decided I'm going to save seeds. So for me, globalization is Monsanto rule over seed. I started to follow it. In 91, the treaty got leaked. Agriculture agreement. Cargill was going to be the trader. No local economies. That's why we have 1 billion people starving. And then, which food will count as safe? Not your grandmother, not your community baker, not your community mithaiwala as we have in India. It'll be Coke, Pepsi, and Nestle, who wrote the rules of the third treaty in WTO called the SPS agreement, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which in effect is food safety, which every day they make local food illegal. Every second day I have to do a civil disobedience to say, no, we know this particular maker of little bit of artisanal food is totally safe. So what did globalization of the WTO period, which begins in 1995, what did it give us? It gave us 1 billion people hungry, 2 billion people sick with bad food. It also gave us the vulnerability to diseases like chronic diseases. So 10 million people are dying every year of cancer, which is totally related to toxics in the environment and toxics in our food. Only 5% cancers are genetic. The rest are all induced by the food we eat and the poisons that we ingest. If you have cancer and you get a COVID infection, the risks of your dying rise to 7.2% from 1%. Now, another of the metabolic diseases that's totally a result of globalized, industrialized food is obesity and diabetes. If you have diabetes, which is a metabolic disease, your system is unable to perform its functions and regulations, the risks of your dying rise up to 9.2%. So we have a layer of globalization from 95 to now. Then you get COVID, which is also a product of globalization, because why are we invading forests? If we have small farms feeding their communities, you don't expand the acreage. Who's expanding the acreage? Who is going into the Amazon? Cargill, Monsanto, Bayer, BlackRock. They are burning the Amazon to grow GMO soya because it's the most profitable commodity, but it doesn't go for food. It goes for biofuel and animal feed. Or who's burning and destroying the forests of Indonesia, which will be gone in 10 years' time? For palm oil. Well, we had linseed and sesame and coconut and mustard. And on each of these, I've had to do a civil disobedience because these oils are good for us. But this isn't all. Free trade and globalization, as embodied in WTO or the East India Company Treaty, are basically deregulation of commerce. They're regulating the local and leaving the global free, which means the powerful free. So the first decision made in WTO, and most people don't know, was a decision to allow trade in software and information to be tax-free. This is what allowed the Microsoft and the Googles and all to set up their companies in India so they could hire cheap labor, save $40 billion annually. So the Indians did the software and the Googles, the Microsofts got bigger. If you look at the wealth of the richest people in the world today, And the two richest are basically Amazon, which was created in the year when WTO was created. WTO was created in June. Amazon took birth in July. He's the richest man today. And during the COVID crisis, Jeff Bezos became richer in 1 month by $24 billion. That is globalization for you, where one person who doesn't produce anything, who doesn't actually distribute anything personally, but controls the production and distribution of the world. Or take Bill Gates, on whom I've written my latest book, Oneness versus the 1%. So Microsoft wasn't such a big player, but it's the patents on software and the trade in information that allowed the empire to get bigger and Bill Gates to emerge as, for a long time, the richest man, engaging in so-called philanthropy, but from my analysis in the book, engaging in new colonies, carving out new colonies. So if globalization is about colonization, it's about limitless greed. It's about not respecting or recognizing planetary boundaries that allow us to not have climate change or species extinction, or ecosystem boundaries that protect us from epidemics like the Ebola, like the Corona, like the SARS, like the Lyme disease, like the MERS. The line goes on. All new diseases are coming from invasion, either into ecosystems or into the bodies of living systems. So many of the new diseases, mad cow disease, swine flu, bird flu, all related to industrial farming manipulation of animals. Not healthy for us, not healthy for the planet, but extremely profitable. So we have now, at the time of COVID, an amazing polarization between the 1% and the 99%. And the WHO has just warned that half of humanity has lost its livelihoods during the lockdown. The World Food Programme has warned that every day, 3,000 people are going to be dying of hunger. Million will be starving within this lockdown period if we don't change the paradigm. We have to reset. So what is the resetting? The first step of resetting is to recognize that we are part of a living earth. That's why I call it earth democracy. Recognizing that our first citizenship, our first identity, our first being is as beings of the earth. This is a reset from the illusions of colonialism, of the industrial age, which said, the earth is dead, we are separate from the earth, we are masters, and they created anthropocentrism of humans as superior to other species. But they also constructed the mechanistic worldview. And my book, Staying Alive, has gone into deep depths about how this mechanistic worldview was created by people like Francis Bacon, called the father of modern science, who said the idea that we are part of nature is effeminate. I'm going to give birth to a masculine time. He wrote a book called The Birth of Masculine Time, where we create the illusion of separation so that we can then conquer nature and control her. Boyle said the same thing. He said, if we have relationship with nature, it interferes in our empire over the earth and inferior creatures. But those inferior creatures are our relations. And this idea of superiority is, I believe, the single biggest virus on this planet, creating so much violence, so much brutality, and so much disposability. I am watching how, if we don't have solidarity and compassion in the transition to the post-COVID stage, we could see a new class of not just poor people, but disposable people. And they're already using the language of useless people. In the artificial intelligence world, we'll have 99% useless people. No being on this planet is useless. So Earth democracy is the recognition that living democracies are created by people working with the earth. And the creative powers of both, giving us sustainability, renewability, and making sure everyone's needs are met. That's why Gandhi said the earth has enough for everyone's needs, but not for a few people's greed. But earth democracy is based on what I call living democracy. Living democracy is the recognition that we are part of the democracy of life, but it is also recognizing that we have the power. We very often hand over our power. We delegate our power. How we live, how we think is in our hands. That can't be forced. That's why Gandhi gave us the amazing concept that the highest duty and freedom we have is the power to say no to injustice, to lies, to untruth. And he called it satyagraha, the power of truth, the force of truth. And finally, living cultures. When we know we are part of the earth family, we have a democracy of life and a culture of life. We will not hurt any other species. We will not hurt another human being. Compassion flows out of our awareness we are related. We will not be able to think like a Samuel Huntington, who writes a book on Clash of Civilizations and says, I cannot know who I am till I know who I hate. How can a negative economy and a negative identity create your identity? Your identity is a positive economy of relationship, a positive identity of knowing who you nourish and who nourishes you. That is the resetting we need. And the resetting is a change in our thinking and our paradigms. It's a change in our living. And in a way, the lockdown has been a good rehearsal to show we don't have to be consumers, running and shopping and thinking somehow shopping brings me satisfaction. We've had to come back to a slow living, and a slow living with a lighter footprint. And that's why everywhere rivers are flowing cleaner, the skies are more blue, animals are roaming streets. We need to take a lesson to say, if this is the way the world should be, then let's make sure that post-COVID, we learn to live with other species and not have illusions of industrialism being more effective and efficient to meet our needs. It's a very clumsy system. My work on industrial agriculture has shown it's absolutely inefficient in producing more food. It's hugely inefficient in terms of bringing us health. And it is displacing because fossil fuels had only one objective, how to get rid of the farmer. Now they're talking about farming without farmers. But if you have farming without farmers, it's an end of agriculture, because agriculture means the care of the land. A robot in the skies can't care for the soil. My hands can give love to the soil. I can work with the soil with my heart and hand and head. And this unity of our being with the unity of all beings and the unity with the living earth is earth democracy. If we can learn to shift from globalization to earth democracy, humanity has a future. If we fail in this reawakening, for a little while longer, the billionaires will become the trillionaires, 50% humanity will be dumped, and slowly we will lose our creativity, our freedom, our ability to act.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Shiva, for that. Earth democracy, so interesting. Are there any questions from the attendees for Dr. Shiva? Any questions? Well, I mean, I've got one. Oh, actually, there's one. Let me just take one from Vishak. Cool, I've just unmuted you. You there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Vishak.
Hey, hello, Dr. Shiva. So the tools of globalization are fairly amoral, or they don't lean in any specific direction. So even if there's a pushback, even if things are done differently, how can these tools be used in this new world that you describe, in a localist world? All these tools that have brought us together, these tools that let us across all these distances talk to each other right now, how can they be used in this new universe?
Well, for every tool, the three things I've done throughout my life, both as a scientist as well as a citizen, is I always decide, do I need a tool? Which tool do I need? Do I need a pen? Do I need my paper? And I haven't given up. I still write my books like this. I prefer the tool of paper and pen because it interacts better with my creativity and imagination. I write in a deeper way, in this way. I don't believe that for anything, there's only one tool. The idea there's only pesticides to control pests is wrong, because pesticides create pests, whereas biodiversity control pests. So we should be able to choose. Second is you have to assess the efficacy. If pesticides have failed us, we should dump them and do organic farming. If I am able to choose what I do with this digital platform, fine. But I also am deeply aware that it's also a source of mining data. Otherwise, why would Facebook get as rich as they are for giving free Facebook friendships? Mine the data. That's why the issues of privacy and autonomy are very important in this age. Tools are embedded. And as embedded tools, we have to have the understanding of who shaped them for what, and the power to shape them in a different way for a different use while controlling the more powerful interests. The third thing about tools is no tool that comes without baggage. You talk of globalization as neutral. No. When Cargill writes the rule of trade, those rules of trade have a Cargill imprint. When a Monsanto writes the intellectual property rights to pretend they're inventors of seed, it has that imprint. Nothing human beings create are independent of the imprint of human beings. And that doesn't mean things are inevitable. It does mean agency of multiple players has to be active. And that multiple players is democracy. And when we realize the agency of other life forms has to be, look at it, one little virus has brought the world to a halt. Isn't it time to reset and say, I'm not the most powerful species on this planet? So the idea of globalization, building on the idea of the earth as inert matter and other beings as objects, that has to be reset. So it just means a deeper consciousness and a deeper context setting of everything.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Vishak, and thank you, Dr. Shiva. I'll jump in here. So I guess, could you give us some advice on what we can do, active steps we can all take to try to reset during this time, until the dust settles?
Yeah. I didn't start saving seeds because I came from an agriculture discipline. I started to save them because I realized that if I didn't save them, we would lose our seeds, we would lose our diversity, we would lose our freedom, and we would be dependent on one company, which is what Monsanto had said, all seeds will be GMO, all seeds will be patented. We've seen what the BT cotton did in my land. Most of the farmers' sow sites are in the BT cotton areas. So what can we do? We can save seeds. Why do I work on agriculture? Again, not my disciplinary background. I work on agriculture because I realize that industrial farming has become the single biggest cause of destruction of the planet and destruction of society. Punjab, the most prosperous state, was reduced to a destroyed land. That's why I wrote my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, for the United Nations University. Now with Corona, people are realizing if you don't know where your food comes from, you're going to be cursed to live on a diet of junk food, get chronic diseases, and the tiniest of infections will be able to kill you. Whereas if you have a healthy diet, then the infections can come and go, and you have the resilience and you have the immunity to deal with them. That's why everyone doesn't die of an infection. And the people who are dying of most of infections have the chronic diseases. On Earth Day this year, I suggested to everyone, have a garden. Even if it's one pot in your balcony, both to make the shift, the reset. That little pot, the one seed and one plant, is a reset of your relationship with the universe. But more than that, it'll give you some basil leaves, and that'll be healthy for you to eat. And if you have a little patch, or if you have a roof, grow a bigger garden. Yeah. If you don't have that, innovate. Everyone thinks innovation is only a new tool. That is hardware or a management tool. The true innovation is doing things differently. Mm-hmm. At the time of war, where there was hunger, they created what they call victory gardens. And that's what fed America. 50% food came from victory gardens. 50% food in UK came from victory gardens. It is time for us to create gardens everywhere, and a creation and the innovation of new relationships between farmers and eaters. This is where so much innovation is happening. It's below the radar. For the simple reason, some big, giant poison cartel member isn't making super profits. In fact, they're losing profits. I'm so glad to tell you that because we saved cotton seeds, there was a report that said farmers saving cotton seeds has led to $12 million losses for Monsanto. And till these destructive forces become less powerful, the resurgent forces will not be able to grow bigger. But you can begin with food. Everyone has a duty to eat right. Everyone has the power to reshape the food system, and everyone has a right to real food and good food.
That's great advice. We've just got a few more questions come through, and I think it'd be great off the back of.
End in the next 5 minutes, yeah.
5 minutes. Okay. Well, there's just a question that was submitted in the box. It says, many of us live in our regular workday jobs, raising families. Besides living more consciously, how do we get started on changing our world?
Yeah. So I think the corona has shown there's nothing like a normal, Everyone's work life has been disrupted. For the poor, it's been disrupted very badly. As the ILO has warned, half of humanity is without work. For those who sit behind computers, a work from home has become the way to work. But, so much of the analysis that has come out of the cause for ill health and chronic diseases, one is bad food and super industrial food, and the other is inactivity. So at this point, while you are having to sit in front of your screen, the big change is somehow staying active. And that's why, again, people are turning to India's teaching of yoga. I mean, it's such amazing. It's not a tool that you get from outside. People can't imagine yoga as a tool, but it is the coming alive of the intelligence and brilliance and self-healing capacity of this body. There is nobody in the world who doesn't respect yoga now. That's something you can learn, you can do. And on the food issue, I've already addressed it. But the second very big issue is community. I think one of the big paradigm shifts we need is from atomization to community. We are social beings. We were made to believe we are atoms. Margaret Thatcher in Globalisation said, there's nothing like a society, they're only individuals. No, they're not only individuals. You wouldn't be here if your mother wasn't there, if your parents weren't there. Your children wouldn't be here if you weren't there. So to say you're an atom with no relationship with any other human being around you and all other ecological beings around you is this cage into which we've been locked. And that ability to realize we are community, of course, in lockdown, we're having to put restrictions, but we must make sure that once the lockdowns are lifted, once the corona crisis is over, and all epidemics end, all epidemics have this graph. They have to end. How they end, that's a different matter, but they all end. Epidemics, chronic diseases grow in an exponential. Epidemics go like that. It'll end. We have to make sure that rebuilding community, rebuilding our capacity to work together, and rebuilding adaptability and resilience. We are living in very uncertain, unstable times. The one thing we cannot predict is this was the certain future. Uncertainty. My PhD thesis was on non-locality and non-separability and uncertainty in quantum theory. That is the reality of the world, not mechanistic determinism, not mechanistic control, not the illusion that someone can control something else, but the recognition that in relationship we have potential. Potential is the reality, and that potential can go in an uncertain way, either towards destruction or to a new birth. How we reset will determine that birth.
Great, thank you so much. Do you have time for one more question?
Okay, the last.
There's just one more question that came through. It's from an anonymous attendee, but he or she was asking, can you talk more about what you mentioned earlier about Bill Gates and his new colony building versus new
Okay. But my book, because of the lockdown, the printers can't print it and the existing publishers can't deliver it because courier services are not working, but the title is Oneness versus 1%. I wrote it because at the Paris Summit on Climate Change, I watched Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates with the heads of state on the stage. Only heads of state sit at UN meetings and summit meetings. So I said, since when did billionaires start becoming heads of state? So I started to follow up. And the book really is an analysis of how we got the new technology barons, how the new billionaire class grew, and how with them grew the asset management class. The BlackRock. BlackRock is 23 trillion. It was zero at the time of the 2008 Wall Street crisis. What are the new colonies? I mean, I've been interviewed, and you all can look at various interviews on Democracy Now! Or France 24, or there are many, many interviews on the book. But I basically see colonialism as someone saying, wow, that could be mine. I can enclose that commons, and I can make the people whose commons it was, for whom it was free, pay me rents. The East India Company did that with land in India, and the peasants had to pay them rent. That's why we had famines in the British time, with the last being the Great Bengal famine of 2 million people dead. It wasn't that there wasn't rice, but the rice was being extracted by the British Empire. Monsanto suddenly says, we patent seed. Do they make seed? They can't. You have to take a seed to manipulate it. Monsanto, I say, is taking that work forward, because not only is he picked up every failed experiment, we threw out the GM aubergine, the GM brinjal from India. He finances it in Bangladesh. We threw out the golden rice because it's an inefficient way to produce vitamin A. He financed it in Philippines, and there are movements against it there. But the two big colonies, very big colonies, that are being carved out are the colony for the earth itself as a colony. So Bill Gates is actually financing geoengineering. That's what it's called. Engineering the planet, managing its climate. And I don't think that's given to him. It's being stopped again and again in UN treaties. Another place where he's carving out a colony is manipulating living systems through what is called gene editing and gene drives. Now, gene drives are an extinction technology. If I do gene drive of amaranth, which is one of the projects, I can push amaranth to extinction, and amaranth is one of the most nutritious sacred crops that we eat in India. So I think engineering the planet and manipulating its climate is ecologically and ethically wrong. I think pushing species to extinction against all the laws and against ethics is not right. Most importantly, he has undone treaties that were meant to regulate. I mean, just yesterday, Mexico has declared its corn as its national heritage to stop the intellectual plunder. But Bill Gates is trying to take genomic maps, digital maps, and saying, I'll patent it this way. That too is creating a colony from inside life. So I say the first colonization was about declaring the earth dead, inert, empty of people. The next colonization was declaring life empty. I call it bio-nullius. If that was terra nullius, this bio-nullius. And now, of course, a lot of the data mining is declaring our minds as empty, to be mined and then be fed. This is an ontological resetting of what it means to be human, not from the human being's perspective, but the perspective of my dear Bill Gates. And I'm sure you're following how important he is as a player in this COVID crisis, because he's on every TV telling every government what they should do. And this is something new. Yes, it was the case that East India Company got Queen Elizabeth to sign a charter, but every ruler is signing things for the new billionaires. And I believe deeply in the equality of all humans. I do not believe in patriarchy. I think men and women are different, but not unequal. I believe the color of our skin doesn't make us unequal. I do not believe that we are superior to other beings. We are part of the earth. And that's why this ontological resetting that's being attempted is going so against every ethical, ecological, human principle that needs a resetting to revive. So it'll be an interesting 2 years to watch. We must do our bit. And our most important bit is to be independent in our thinking through our relationships, through knowing what supports us, through being grateful to those who support us, including all the caregivers who were rendered as the lowest rung of the economy. And if today they weren't there, people would be dying like flies. So not only should we thank the caregivers, my next piece of work is a manifesto I'll be writing with my team on the economy of care. If we'll have an economy of care, we have a future. If all we'll have is an economy of greed, we won't have anything. Okay, I will have to leave you. Bye.